comes from the book of John, chapter 18, verses 33 through 37. Please rise in spirit or in body for the reading of the gospel. Hear now the word of our Lord. Pilate went back into the palace. He summoned Jesus and asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this on your own, or have others spoken to you about me?" Pilate responded, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your nation and its chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus replied, "My kingdom doesn't originate from this world. If it did, my guards would fight so that I wouldn't have been arrested by the Jewish leaders. My kingdom isn't from here." "So you are a king," Pilate said. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. I was born and came into the world for this reason, to testify to the truth. Whoever accepts the truth listens to my voice." That is truth, Pilate said. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Almighty God, may the words of my mouth and indeed the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. You may be seated. So who here knows who Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys are? A few of you, right? A few of you do. Not many. That's a shame. If you have never heard of them, as soon as we're done here today, go home and look them up. Listen to them. I was talking with a couple of people earlier before the service started, and I spent 5 years in Texas, and I did not get much from it. But what I did get was an abiding love of Texas music. Bob Wills and his Texas Playboys were basically the founders of Western swing music, beginning in the 1920s. They're arguably still the best example of that as well. Kind of a combination of Western music and big band music. He was, and they were a huge hit in Texas and Oklahoma and the surrounding areas, but they never hit as big outside of the Southwest because, see, they used drums in their music, and the Grand Ole Opry did not allow at the time drums to be used in any music that was being played out of the Opry. And so they only got to play the Opry one time in their entire history. And they'd say, well, we just won't play drums, but they did anyway, and the Opry banned them for life. Well, in the 1970s, a good Methodist named Willie Nelson, true story, started making waves out of Austin. Began this kind of outlaw country movement. I bet you didn't think you were going to be getting a country music lesson here today. Lots of folks said that Willie and his ilk were the best music to ever come out of the Lone Star State. Well, Willie had a buddy named Waylon Jennings, and Waylon took exception to this. He recorded a song with a lyric declaring his musical allegiance. At the end of every verse, there was one form or another of this line: "It don't matter who's in Austin, Bob Wills is still the king." Around the time that Bob Wills was taking up the fiddle, Pope Pius XI took stock of the international order. The Great War had ended less than a decade earlier. Christian Europe had burned itself to the ground. More people had been killed in what would become known as World War I than any war in human history up to that point. One of the root causes of the war had been the rise of ethno-nationalism in Europe. The idea that our ultimate allegiance and our ultimate identity belong to the nation state. The gospel of nationalism was that those who live within the same borders as you and those who share the same racial characteristics as you are more worthwhile than those outside of your borders, outside of your ethnicity. There had been a hope that the devastation caused by the Great War would put that ideology to rest, but again, as the world entered the 1920s, nationalism was on the rise. Benito Mussolini's fascists had gained power in Italy. Spain was in the early days of the Civil War between communists and their own homegrown fascists. The new National Socialist Party, which would become known as the Nazis, they were on the rise in Germany, and many other nations were following the same path. Pius was, as it turned out, rightly concerned where all of this would lead. In 1925, he instituted a new holy day for the Catholic Church, which, as time went on, other branches of Christianity would take on for itself. Called this the reign of Christ the King. Christ the King, the reign of Christ. On the last Sunday of the year before Advent began. The purpose of Reign of Christ Sunday was to remind humanity, rulers and common people alike, that it doesn't matter who sits in the halls of power. It doesn't matter what country you live in. It doesn't matter what flag flies above your post office, what language you speak, what your ethnic background is. Christ is still the King. Christ is King of the world, of all people, of all places. To kill based on a nation, our race, our language, is to commit an act of rebellion against our true ruler. And so, in effect, Pope Pius was saying, it don't matter who's in Berlin, or Rome, or Madrid, or London, or Moscow, or D.C. Christ is still the King. The church at the end of the first century was faced with a very similar problem and decision. Rome demanded that all under its rule, Christians included, pay allegiance to the Roman state and the Roman emperor. To give sacrifice, to make sacrifice to Caesar. To proclaim that Caesar is Lord. That Caesar is the Son of the Most High God. And look, Rome was the most powerful institution, the most powerful anything that most people could imagine. And the choice that they had is that they could obey. They could pay obeisance to Rome and to the emperor, even if it just meant crossing their fingers behind their back, saying Caesar is Lord, and surviving another day. Or they could refuse and continue to give their allegiance to Jesus Christ, who was, keep in mind, someone who had been killed by this very same Rome. It was pretty obvious to everyone who had more power. The institution, the state that could kill anyone, especially a poor rabbi like Jesus. Rome obviously had more power, at least in the conventional sense. So what should they do? What should the early Christians have done? There was a large contingent that said, just say Caesar is Lord, cross your finger behind your back, and get on with your day. Well, John, the author of Revelation, he ends up making a really bold claim. He says, this 33-year-old poor rabbi from the backwaters of the Roman Empire who was killed by the Roman state John says that this same Jesus is and was and is to come. He has not conquered only armies like the legions of Rome, but he has conquered death itself, and he rules over all the kings and nations of the earth. Think about how ridiculous this claim seems. A man who was executed by the state is more powerful than all the kings, all the emperors, all the nations, all the empires. This obscure rabbi who was unceremoniously dumped in a borrowed grave, who was put on an illegal trial by Pilate, a second-rate functionary who was essentially in exile for not being very good at his job. But that's exactly what Revelation is claiming. Because John says we have completely missed the real meaning of power. We've completely missed the real meaning of strength. Yes, Caesar may have his legions and his governors and his tax collectors and his fortresses and his riches, but like everything else, Caesar is temporary. Gold will tarnish and iron will rust and men will die, but Christ is, and Christ was, and Christ will be. Christ shows us what real power looks like. It's not swords, it's not armies, it's not wealth. No, instead, he has given his life to set us free, to forgive us, to love us, to transform us, to deliver us from fear and from sin. And that is the kind of power that has no end. Y'all, we'll talk about this more in depth at some point. I know that when we read Revelation, when Tracy read a little bit from Revelation earlier, some of you got a little nervous that, oh my gosh, he's about to talk about the beast and all that good stuff. But Revelation is not necessarily primarily about the future. It's about how to live in the hope right this moment that Christ rules over all. And that means it has something crucial to tell us right now, right this minute. Look, I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know by saying that we live in divided times. We do. Once again, across the world, parochial nationalism is on the rise. Nations rise up against nation. We divide ourselves by country and ethnicity, by language, by culture, by political party and ideology. As the recent elections have shown us, whoever gains office will cause about half the population to rejoice and the other half to mourn. We are willing to say and do the most horrible things to one another as long as we can say, well, they're different than us. They're not our kind of people. We put our trust in presidents, in legislators, in governors. Sure, the last one let us down, the last 5 let us down, the last 100 let us down, but this one will bring us peace and prosperity. This one will make things good. As much as we were 2,000 years ago, we are willing to give our allegiance to kings and states that will eventually fall. That use fear and violence to keep us in line and ask us to love them for it. Revelation boldly calls this out. Boldly called it out 2,000 years ago and still does. Revelation says, don't be afraid. Don't let yourself be seduced by worldly power or prosperity. Don't put your trust in that which doesn't last, no matter how powerful it looks, no matter how eternal those things look. They will fail. They will fade. But instead, give your allegiance to the one who embodies the truth, to the true ruler who cannot be defeated, who reigns with the power of love and compassion. It don't matter, as Whalen would say, it don't matter who's in the White House, U.S. Capitol. Christ is still the king. And it doesn't matter what flag flies over you, Christ is still the king. If you're discouraged because your candidate or your party lost the election, Christ is still the king. If you're elated that your candidate won, Christ is still the king. So let us love one another. Do good to one another. Take care of one another. Because Christ is still the king. In the name of God the Father,